The first panel was amazing. It was kind of the elements of leadership and leadership as I learned it, leadership as I did it. That was, I thoroughly enjoyed it. What we're going to have now is a panel where Navy leadership had to take a situation and do something completely out of the box. Now, it's titled Leadership Under Adversity, but it probably should better be termed sometimes the unexpected happens and you have to deal with it. And then there's other shorter ways of saying that same thing. It happens, all right? So the panel members of this one are all accomplished naval leaders. We have retired Vice Admiral Crowder, who's currently the chairman of the Olmsted Foundation. We have Vice Admiral Card, who's with Oak Ridge Laboratories. We have Captain Burt, who's with Boeing, and Captain Ted Williams. What a great name. Captain Ted Williams, who's President and CEO of the Williams Group. Now, that's what they're doing now. They're all retired, accomplished naval leaders. And I'm not going to detail their biographies, which are your bulletin, but if you read them, you would see that they have a rich history of operational excellence, of leading excellence, and experience. Rather, what I'm going to do is try to set the table for the discussion we're going to see, because this is leadership in a way that you don't expect it sometimes. I want you to think back a little bit. The date is 26 December 2004, the day after Christmas. Think about what the world is like, commands are like, the attitude is like the day after Christmas, all right? At that date, there was a 9.4 level earthquake in the Pacific that resulted in a tsunami that was just huge. This tsunami came and devastated Sumatra, Indonesia, Phuket, Thailand, and Sri Lanka off the coast of India, which was 1,000 miles to the west. Now, it's for us in the United States, or if you were reading the papers, it's a headline or a news item. But if you were in that area, if you were in that theater, this was absolutely huge. Because these are coastal communities. These are communities that have subsistence living, meaning they collect on a day-to-day basis for living. And we had an event that killed, after which there were over 200,000 people either dead or missing. I mean, think about it. Now, the human dimension of this was huge. The needs of the people were incredible. They had nothing, absolutely nothing. No food, no water, no shelter. And the immediate need, the immediacy was urgent across hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. The United States responded by forming a joint task force, but that joint task force was going to take a couple of days to get in place and get operational. But the United States did respond. The United States responded with the United States Navy. They responded with a ship that had these commanders on board, and they responded in a way that changed history. So much so that almost 8 years later, when as a force commander I went to Indonesia for a completely unrelated reason, I was warmly received, and it had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with what I was bringing. It had nothing to do with why I was even there and what we were going to negotiate. I was warmly received because of what the United States had done in their time of need, what the United States Navy had done in their time of need, more specifically, what these four leaders had done in their time of need. So please welcome this man back.
Well, thanks, Drano. I appreciate it. First of all, I'd like to set the stage with my three compatriots here. First is Vice Admiral Kendall Card, call sign Huck, was commanding officer of Abraham Lincoln when this event happened. And to his right is Larry Burt, call sign Buck. He was the CAG 2 at the time. And to his right is Ted Williams, call sign Bench, who was XO of VAQ 131 at the time. So let me go to the first slide here. The strike group was in Hong Kong for a port visit over Christmas. I got two very strange phone calls after this hit, and even before I knew it had hit. One was from the 7th Fleet Commander, John Greenard, and he said that we don't know if you're going to be called to go do this HADR, but I'd really like you to go do this exercise in Korea. So get underway, and I'll never forget this, mosey on down slowly so you don't get too far away. I looked in my DicNavAb, the Dictionary of Naval Abbreviations, and could not find the word mosey. So we got underway and we slowly headed south as not to get out of place for our follow-on exercise in Korea until we started seeing the newsreel from CNN, and I asked Kendall, can you do 32 knots? And he allowed it. That's a sort of moseying. And so we headed down to the Straits of Malacca, and then the next morning, John Greenard called back and said, yep, you're going to have to go. How many days before you get to the Straits of Malacca? I said, about 4 hours. I guess I misunderstood mosey. The other phone call I got was from Lieutenant General Rusty Blackman, who had been designated the JTF commander. He was 3MEF at the time. He said, I understand you're going to chop to me for this. I have no idea what's going on, so here's my commander's guidance. You got a pencil? Yes, sir. Go do good. And I said, that's it? He goes, that's it. And that's what we did. Kendall?
Over to me. So, yeah, so you can imagine we were having a pretty good time in Hong Kong on the 26th. The 27th, we were planning to go either north or south, and on the 28th, we were doing 30 knots plus on our way down. And one of the things that you don't see there is Admiral Crowder said the rest of the strike group will catch us. We'll take one escort, but we want to make sure everybody's current on the way down. So we stopped right off of Ho Chi Minh City there for about 12 hours and did day-night trap for most of the air wing. And then the strike group, the rest of the strike group kind of passed us as we were doing that, and then we caught them in the Straits of Malacca. We did a night transit through the Strait of Malacca at 30 knots, very sporty and a lot of fun. Made the Admiral nervous, maybe the captain too. And arrived there the morning of the 1st of January, early. And Admiral Crowder said, hey, I want to be visible. I want the carrier to be visible when people in Banda Aceh wake up that morning. And since the banks are so steep there, there's deep water right off the coast, enough that we were confident that the earthquake didn't impact it. And so we were right off the coast on the morning of the 1st so that Buck could be heloed in and start negotiations with the authorities there on the island.
Over to me. So anyways, as Air Wing Commander, and we're heading down there trying to make preparations for going in there, one of the things that was kind of cool was Bench, and that's why he's sitting up here with us, is Of all my COs and XOs, Bench came up to me probably 2 days before we were actually going to get there, and he goes, "CAG, what can I do to help you?" And we're trying to figure this out. I'm working with the Admiral's staff on what we're going to do and stuff. And Bench really leaned forward. He had some great ideas, and I said, "Well, one thing you're going to do is you're going to come with me when we go in," and so we did. The situation there in Banda Aceh and in Sumatra there, Sumatra was a closed society to the outside world. They have a civil war going on with the GAM rebels and the TNI, which is the military of the Indonesian government. So this fight's going on. We don't know much about it. We don't know who these GAM rebels are. It's a Muslim country. Osama bin Laden was a national hero there in Sumatra. We saw it on the T-shirts and stuff of a lot of people we had visibility on. A society where a lot of people were riding around. We called them rice bikes, little mopeds with AK-47s on their backs, kind of looking at us and stuff once we got there. So anyways, but we were flying in. We had no comms, no military-to-military relationships. Those had all been severed due to our own Leahy laws in our countries. If you go before the tsunami, there was a uprising in East Timor, a lot of war crime accusations by the UN against Indonesia, and because of that, because of our own laws, we severed all foreign aid, all military to military, and pulled out of that country, essentially with the exception of an embassy in Jakarta. So we didn't know who to talk to, who would be there to greet us, and so anyways, we flew in. I tell you, these next slides will just kind of show you the amount of devastation that the Banda Aceh hit, but all the way down the coastline, which was completely cut off from any kind of aid getting to them. There's only one coastal road. There's no inland roads there because of the mountains, and 95 bridges completely washed away. So hit the slide. This is a before and after shot. That's right on the peninsula there, right in Banda Aceh. Next slide. That used to be a little village along the coastline. You can see where the wave hits the mountains in the background, just kind of strips away all the vegetation and all the houses and stuff there.
You know, on this slide, I took the Minister of Defense up for a helicopter, overview because he had not seen it. And I pointed out that the only building in this entire village that was left was the mosque. And I think it was because it was the best structure built in the entire village. And he said, no, it's Allah's will. And I said, well, of course.
These are some shots taken right in the city of Banda Aceh itself. On this one, in the red circle, as Huck mentioned, the Admiral wanted us to be visible. He pulled the carrier right off the coast of the city there so the people of the city could at least see we were there. And that was pretty cool. The hazards of that was debris fields and stuff in the water, lots of bodies, lots of, I guess, hazards to navigation, and just the psyche of the sailors trying to work on the flight deck as bodies go floating by your ship was creating some issues in and of itself. But we were there front and center as we flew in. As we went into the airfield, and I'll get to this here in just a second on the situation, but as we flew into the airfield, complete chaos on the ground. One usable ramp that we could actually land our helicopters on. Refugees all over the place, nobody in charge. And we jump out of the helicopters and try to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? And Bench was with me. He went one way, I went the other way. We regrouped after a little bit. We figured out that the TNI were in a small hangar at the far end of the field. We worked our way down there. A colonel came out. I started talking with him, and I quickly realized that there is a two-star inside the building. He is in charge. They've got military law established in the city. The civil government's wiped out. The governor is still alive, but his whole family's gone. He's in a state of depression and non-functioning. So this two-star's kind of running the show. He won't talk to me. And it's just cultural things. I was wearing 06. He was wearing 2-star. He expected a 2-star if the U.S. Navy is going to come in and help. So I sent one of the helos back to the ship, grabbed Admiral Crowder and brought him in, and that's where we kind of started our initial negotiation and got the relief ops going. Next slide.
Well, this is a photograph of Larry Burt and I breaking the law and having a interchange with the TNI, the Leahy Amendment that we talked about. I'd gotten a phone call from our ambassador there in the country, Ambassador Lynn Pascoe, and same thing, he didn't have much information. He just gave me one piece of guidance: remember whose country this is. And I took that to heart, and we were able to set up an interchange with the TNI led by Major General Bang Bang here, and then we were pretty much off to the races.
Sometimes you just have the right tools at the right time, and we were blessed to have that. This was in addition to the HS squadron that normally is part of the air wing. This was if Gary Jones is out there, this was the first Bravo to sea. So we had an HSL squadron embarked at the same time, and during our shortened workup period between Iraqi Freedom and this deployment, we had spot 7 and 8 of the carrier certified for operations. So we're able to basically start up 8 helicopters on 8 spots every morning. Total of 17 helicopters, obviously 5 helicopter-capable ships, and 6,500 sailors in the strike group that were all anxious to help in any way. And I think we'll talk a lot more about that over the next few slides. And we sent in between 75 and 100 people every morning, and because the Indonesians wanted a minimum footprint, we brought them back every night at dusk. And as a result, that kept us pretty busy throughout every daylight minute, trying to optimize. And this is an early morning launch. Anything to add, Buck?
The other thing we did is we surveyed the ship for skill sets. Who knows how to drive forklifts? Who knows how to repair things? Obviously, sailors have lots of skills, ones that we train them in, and then others that just know how to do things like drive a tractor or something like that. We didn't know what we needed at the time, so we had a database we built so we could grab the right people if there was a need or a situation when we found it.
I think one of the most important things was the flexibility of both the air wing and the ship to not do excessive planning. Let's just get out and start doing this. And on day one, we started missions, which I thought was important.
So when we got there, again, it was complete chaos. Bench and I were running around trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? How do we get this relief operation going? Again, like Kendall mentioned, we brought in about 100 sailors with us, or we started bringing them in once we realized that we need some help. And it's amazing what a senior chief can do to get a airport functioning again. And that's what we did. We brought some of the chiefs in. We brought an air traffic controller in. The tower at the airfield had collapsed. Relief started arriving about the time we got there, so these aircraft were stacked up out there, not able to talk to anybody, and just kind of coming in VFR, runway looks okay, and landing, and then dumping stuff off and leaving. And there's, like I said, it was chaos. There was stuff all over the place. So you put 120 sailors to work with a senior chief in charge. They got that operation fixed, got everything organized. We moved the helicopters over to a soccer field. That's what you see in the picture there, so that we could bring these airplanes in. We marshaled them. The Lincoln was providing air traffic control. We'd put them in a marshal stack, bring them in, offload them, get them out because there's only room for one airplane, and then the next guy would come in. And this was going on all day long, bringing in relief supplies, sailors loading them on trucks, bringing them over to this soccer field, and then we were putting them on the helicopters, sending them downrange, and then picking people up, lots of injured people, and bringing them back. You can see in the background other tents we're setting up. Lots of organizations coming in, setting up their medical facilities, different things that they're bringing into this particular problem. Very reliant on us to be kind of the leadership. You know, where do you want us? What can we do? That kind of stuff. So we were, as best we could, providing those kinds of things. What else, Benj?
Well, thanks, CAG. And as I went ashore with CAG that January 1st, 2005, rainy morning, CAG mentions he went off to talk to the TNI. My job was to find the Aussie leadership that we thought was already at the field. So I went in search of what we had heard was an Australian colonel. Couldn't find any such thing. The senior Aussie individual there was an E5, and he said, yeah, our leadership hasn't made it up here yet. So in my hour, when I went trying to scurry a leadership team and see who was actually there, the one person I did find was the U.S. Embassy had sent up an U.S. Army major who spoke Indonesian, Major Nelson, and he was fantastic and able to help us with the coordination. NGOs were already there, supplies were already there, but we had to quickly develop that coordination and figure out where we were going to go. CAG then set up with the further follow-on meetings that day with the TNI, the Indonesian military, where to go, and they were handing yellow stickies, yellow Post-it notes with lat longs to our helicopter pilots for the first few missions, the first part of the day to get stuff downrange and get stuff down to the folks. Lat longs is the word we set up the landing zones down the 100 miles worth of coast that was decimated.
So you can see sailors forming lines. The temperatures there were very hot, very humid. Remember, we're on the southern hemisphere, so it's summertime down there. Next slide. Just kind of click through a couple of these.
Let me just jump in here. A couple of things to this slide. We, as CAG stated, we had about 150 folks ashore every day, and as I walked around the ship, sailors were begging to be in the next 150. You know, they had an opportunity to provide this relief, which I thought was great. The other great line that came out of this, as we mentioned, we brought everyone back on board at night and went off about 50 miles to sea. And Kendo had a great saying: instead of boots on the ground, we're doing heads on pillows at night. And one of these nights I got a call from Kendo who said, "Admiral, I don't know how to tell you this." I said, "Well, go ahead, Kendo, you've called." He said, we just had a collision with a house. So I quickly looked at my screen. I thought we were supposed to be 50 miles off. And I said, how the hell did he get so close in? And sure enough, we were still 50 miles out, but some house floated by, and it was CBDR, and I'm not sure we even reported that. This is the first public announcement of that, Kendall.
Well, the reporting system was not the same as it is today. Obviously, if we have a tsunami today, the world knows or a major earthquake, the world knows in seconds. But the first report, when we got this big bump in the night, and first I called the RO, I said, hey, you guys sustain any damage down there to a screw or something? You know, we obviously bumped something. And he goes, yeah, I felt the shudder. I have no idea what it is. So we called, we called Hawaii and said, hey, have you guys heard, is there any other earthquake in the vicinity? And they said, no, we don't have anything recorded. So, in those days, it took about 12 hours. Now it takes probably 12 seconds, but it was about 12 hours. So 12 hours later, when the RO and I are still talking about whether we ought to inspect the screw and the rudders, the report comes in that yes, there was a 6.3 that was almost directly underneath us at the time. Fortunately, it did not precipitate another tsunami, but another major earthquake that gave us a shudder that I'll remember for a long time.
One of the things that Bench mentioned was the help that showed up. This major that came in that spoke fluent Indonesian was awesome. He was truly, helped us immensely with the language barrier, the culture and stuff. A couple medics showed up from Fort Bragg. These were Special Forces guys. I don't know how they got there, but these two guys just showed up and said, we're here to help. They had medical packs on. We threw them in the helicopter. We'd take them downrange, drop them off, and come back at the end of the day, and they would have 15 or 20 people laying there on the, ready to get picked up. They've already done triage medicine on them, a lot of them broken legs, gangrene, dehydrated type of stuff, and we'd come in at the end of the day and pick them up. And these guys would just work their way through the jungle and these destroyed villages and just find people that needed help, get the locals to help them and get them rallied to a certain point, and then we take them out. The other thing that was interesting, this young, I call him a kid, young kid, 27-year-old USAID guy shows up. He's all tatted up, he's got a ring in his mouth, and just a little bit different than us. But again, this guy was awesome. He spoke the language fluently. He had a $10 million checkbook with him from President Bush, and I made him kind of my right-hand guy. And I said, he was there to help get the government going, and whatever he could do with a checkbook to do. So we started buying bridges, for instance, Bailey bridges, from some company up in Sweden. And they were putting them on ships and getting them down as fast as they could so we could drop these Bailey bridges on all these 95 bridges that were along this coastal highway that had gotten washed out. So we had to reconnect a lot of these areas here. So he was writing checks for that. We needed a place to put the UN. The UN and the TNI weren't working together. They wouldn't even talk to each other because of all these war crime allegations and stuff. So I was the go-between, or we were the go-between between a lot of these NGOs and the military who were running the thing. So we wanted to get the government back in charge so that the UN could work with the civil government, not the TNI. And so we went out in town and rented a big building that wasn't destroyed for the UN to operate out of. And he brought his checkbook. They moved in. We started providing intel, situational awareness to them on where they could best put their different NGOs and relief operations along the coast to provide the most help. And one of the other things we did was the hospital got wiped out. It wasn't destroyed, but the wave came in and took the first floor of the hospital out and left about a foot of mud in there. The plumbing, the electrical, all that was completely out in the building. We had these tent hospitals set up at the airfield, but they really needed to get some of these people into a better facility to take care of them. So we brought sailors in and cleaned up that hospital. The first floor was just labor. How do you get 1.5 feet, 2 feet of mud out of the hospital? And then we brought in the electricians and some of the engineers and got the hospital up and running. They were bringing parts out to the ship. We were rebuilding alternators for their generators, and we basically got the plumbing and the electrical and put that hospital back in operation, and then started moving a lot of these tent city triage units into the hospital so that they could start caring for the people out there. And they had good clean water to work with there.
And further onto that point, CAG, one of the unique takeaways from this whole story was, as the Admiral mentioned, the mantra to go do good. We really had no idea what we would see or what we would come across. And day one, my job was really to set up the tactical ops on the airfield and work with the helos and get them going to the right spot. And the helicopter pilots would tell me as they went down to their landing zones, of course, and dropping off aid, there'd be clusters, of course, of people there. But as they came back and flew back, they would see small pockets of people that couldn't get to the aid, but were wandering around. Now, mind you, it was about 7 days. When we got there, it was 7 days after the tsunami hit. So there were people that were still obviously in great need. Dehydration, infection were setting in. So we didn't have permission at the time, but they asked me if they could put people in the helos coming back, and I said, absolutely. So we did that. I then called CAG and the Admiral, and they said, yep, great, let's do it. And we saw an immediate need and impact. Day one, I can remember we carried off a small 7-year-old girl, listless, dehydrated, significant infection, near death, put her in a hospital tent. Next day, we saw her turn on cartwheels. It was just phenomenal, the change that we were able to impact immediately with these people that were in great need.
You can see that a lot of the places that our helicopter pilots would fly into, one of the neat privileges I had, I was an F-18 pilot in the Navy, but I did fly with our helicopter squadrons, one of the benefits you get for being air wing. They taught me how to fly the helo before we ever deployed, so I was comfortable doing it. And then we trucked the helos out. We took anything off the helo that could unscrew and leave and wasn't critical for flight, so that we could carry more in the helo. So all the seat belts, seats, doors, whatever that we could take off and out of the airplanes we did. Particularly the Bravos, which were an ASW configured helicopter. They're not configured to carry lots of cargo and injured people and stuff. We were kind of inventing it as we went. Can we unscrew this and, take it out? We'll put it back later. Hopefully it'll fit, kind of stuff. But did a lot of that, and the guys were flying into these devastated areas. Just phenomenal airmanship, getting into certain places to help people, and then pulling people out and giving them the relief that they needed and stuff. It was amazing what they were doing.
This is what would be considered an unsatisfactory FOD walk down, But the larger point is we're all used in combat missions to take risk. These guys took risk in the mission they were given, and my hat's off on the kind of environment that they flew into to make sure that these people got what they needed as far as relief.
Yeah, as a helicopter guy, I snuck off the ship a couple of times to fly a couple of missions in, and I can tell you that it was absolutely terrific. You'd see 6 or 7 folks waving you, looked like they needed relief, and you'd go down and land, and out of the rubble, there would be 30, 40, 50 people come out of the rubble as you landed to come in. Very organized. The mayors or whatever those small towns, we'd stack the stuff and they'd start passing it out in a very organized fashion. The toughest part of the mission was trying to clear the kids out of the tail rotor because they like to jump up in the wash as you left, So they, but very rewarding missions. I flew a couple of folks on medevacs back to Banda Aceh. I'll remember, forever, this probably 8-year-old girl with her mother, leg broken in about 5 different places, gangrene just starting to set in, and they were able to airlift her to Medan and saved her leg as well. So lots of very rewarding things going on every day.
One of the things that Huck mentioned is the orderly fashion that they'd come up. It wasn't that way at the very beginning because a lot of them were very desperate, and when we landed in some of these areas, as you can see like in this picture, we got rushed, and that wasn't safe, and that was a big concern. How do we get people back? And so the direction to my pilots was, if they're going to do that, you leave, and they're going to have to learn, and just get away, hover back, tell them to move away, and then try it again. And if they start rushing you, again, just pull out, and hopefully they'll learn. We very quickly realized maybe some leaflets or something that we could throw down there might help, and we did that. And finally, the word, I think, kind of started spreading, but basically telling the elders of these villages, whomever is surviving and kind of in charge, control your people, we'll get everything off the helo, we want to do this orderly, we don't want anybody hurt, and then tell us if you have anybody you want us to take away that needs help, needs medical and stuff. So we had all these leaflets built up, so we'd throw them out in some of these areas before we landed, give them a few minutes to read it, and then we'd come in and you'd be amazed. And so that problem stopped pretty quick, and then they were somewhat orderly in it. A lot of the villages we went into were GAM rebel controlled, which we didn't know. And this was a problem with the TNI, and this became a friction point between us and the TNI, and there was a relationship we're trying to work through. They were fighting these rebels. Now, they had agreed to a ceasefire because of this tsunami, but the communications downrange, there was none. So we didn't know whether these GAM rebels really were part of, had gotten the word not to shoot at us. Our concern was we're working with the TNI. One thing we decided not to do, and this was one of Admiral Crowder's decisions, we were not going to move TNI troops downrange. And so we told the two-star that in the village, because he wanted to put his people downrange to try to get control of these areas so the GAM didn't take over. And we said, no, we're not going to do that, because if we get labeled as moving his troops, we now become targets to the GAM rebels, and I didn't want our helicopters getting shot at downrange. So we said no troops. And so they kept negotiating back and forth, and finally we said, okay, we will take your medical folks downrange, but they need to be medically identifiable, meaning let's put Red Cross armbands on them and stuff so that everyone knows they're doctors and corpsmen and medics and things like that, and not soldiers. The next morning we come in there, and he's got about 12 squads of soldiers with their rucksacks, their rifles, and white medical bands with little red crosses on them, sitting on the ramp waiting to go down range. These were his medics and stuff. And so that was a bit of a challenge. Called the boss, Admiral, what do you want to do? And we finally decided, okay, if they're going to wear the bands, we'll take them down range. And so we started shuttling them down. But
I think in the end, this slide shows that the need was much appreciated, and despite all the rush toward the helicopters and an incredible sort of scenarios that these pilots were flying into, we really didn't have a single incident in the end, mostly because of the great things initiatives that were taken to make this as safe as possible.
Oh, that's me. So again, as Admiral Crowder said, depending on the day, lots of different people were going in. We started with the corpsmen, docs, and nurses, of course, but to do that initial triage. But everyone on the ship was volunteering to do anything they could to help the situation. So this is just one picture of the startup of the tents, and I think Buck can maybe add to this, but the goal, the Aussies arrived pretty quickly with their medical staff, as they said, and the goal was to triage these folks as quickly as possible and to airlift the more serious cases down to Medan for extra care. So a great effort overall internationally. Anything to add here?
yeah, the one thing, the docs, I mean, these guys did amazing work. And so I had 2 flight surgeons in my air wing. We had a lot of doctors as part of the ship. We'd bring them in every day. China came in with for lack of a better term, a MASH unit. And so we set up our tents with them. So we had Chinese doctors and corpsmen with U.S. Navy doctors and corpsmen working together to help these seriously injured people. That was kind of pretty cool to see.
Next slide. The engineers, as they said, the first task was really to get this hospital in working order so that we could start moving folks in. And as a result, AIMD, everybody on the ship pitching in to repair. So every day we're bringing in rusty water-filled parts and overhauling those parts and sending them back in. Typically, we're sending about 10 engineers in every day, and I think they had a shovel in their hands digging out, and brooms digging out mud as much as they did hands-on experience there. But it was a terrific work by the Chang and all of his folks. Next. So the HTs built this little device in about, I think about 3 hours, wasn't it? It just seemed, it appeared overnight. There was a real need for water, and most of the food, water, rice, and bread started off the ship as the shore-based operations were kicking off simultaneously. So it was quite a logistic effort that Larry was controlling. Larry and Bench were controlling there on the beach. And anyway, the HTs made this. I do not know how the supply officer got all of these plastic jugs to the ship as quickly as he did. They just arrived. It was like a miracle. I mean, and because we use thousands of these things Next slide. And this is later on in the operation as well. Again, everybody on the ship wanted to help in any way possible. Every day the working party went in. There was a backup list of, there was about a list of 100 people that were going in. There was a backup list of about another 150 people that were ready to go or were going to go the next day or the day after that. And they did all the lugging and the hard work, and they came back covered, usually on most days, with sweat and mud and looking like they went for a mud run for the day, and with big old smiles on their faces. So terrific work there as well. And then we had an aircraft that had a landing gear problem and clobbered the runway. So we sent the handler in with about 4 or 5 of his guys, and they cleared that aircraft off the runway in 4 or 5 hours after the local authorities had tried for almost a day, I think. And
Yeah, that was a good story. A 737 from some country bringing in a bunch of relief stuff came in at night and hit a water buffalo right at the 4,000-foot marker on an 8,000-foot runway. And he's sitting there collapsed on his his left engine right in the middle of the runway. And it's a single runway airport. So all the relief stuff is stacking up, diverting to Singapore, to Jakarta. Nothing's happening at the airport when we come in the next morning. So like Kendall said, we got the handler and the crash and salvage guys out there. We took a bunch of pictures of it. We got on the radio with Boeing and said, what do we need to do to get this thing off? And they told us, well, get some pipe and weld up that nose gear, because that's going to collapse next if you try to tow this thing off in the tilt that it was on. We got a bunch of forklifts, jammed them into the engine, raised the engine up, put a dolly underneath it, strapped it on, and then the handler got a tractor and they just drug that thing off the runway. And may still be there today, I don't know, but we just got it off the runway.
It really was amazing, the outflow of support from the ship, the crew members on the ship that wanted to help. As you've heard, we had about 150 ashore every day and more that wanted to go ashore. I think a lot of that was the crew members, we could see it. You could see everything that was out there. You could see the debris in the water, which was horrific at times. So everybody wanted to help. We even, at one point, we did a stuffed animal drive. And I think we got about 500 or 600 stuffed animals that we put together and we delivered to the kids in our drop-off of supplies. That was received, of course, very warmly from the children. So it was really amazing to see the great humanity of our crew come together to do great things for the people ashore.
yeah, literally, I did a 1MC announcement and to the crew about the orphans on the beach and how nice it would be to do something. This was from bench, and my CMC came running up with this idea. And within 45 minutes, we filled 5 tri-walls. So for all these kids on the beach, pretty inspiring.
So who would have thought sailors have teddy bears in their racks?
You gave yours up, didn't you, Craig? Yeah.
Well, most of them came from the strike group commander's stash. As we mentioned, there was a civil war going on. The GAM was considered a terrorist organization by our government. They had set up posts there near the soccer field where we were operating. And a couple of things, decision points came. What do we do about force protection? And in the end, I decided that as long as we were providing this much needed aid, the force protection issue was less acute. It was a risk. The other thing that happened, we were getting from the intel types, can you take some pictures of these GAM guys and that sort of thing, send some intel back. This is a great opportunity. And I said, no, last thing we need is for them to think that this is an intel operation. We called our force protection Maslow's hierarchy of force protection. We took everyone off every day at the end of the day, and they weren't there. And kind of what I was telling PAC Fleet was, I think this is going to work, but you need to end this thing while they're still applauding us. And that became kind of my mantra back to Pac Fleet, and I'll talk more about that later. This was not a coalition operation, but many countries sent their Navy there. I think in the end we had 11 different countries. And so there was no command relationships with the other countries. So I tried to establish personal relationship. This is the Japanese task force commander, and give them some ideas, some recommendations of where they should put their force. Like I said, it's about 125 miles worth of coastline that was wiped out, and most of the countries complied with our recommendations. Sometimes it wasn't easy. I had to go to the French ship and drink a number of bottles of wine before I was trusted with my recommendation, but in the end, it's kind of what we do for our country sometimes.
About 10 days or so into the operation, we sent L&Os out. We sent our chief of staff to the JTF headquarters, and I went down to the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, about 1,000 miles south. This is a great picture of Ambassador Lynn Pascoe, who really was a wonderful statesman, but didn't have a lot of knowledge or experience previously working with the military. He had taken over as the ambassador of Indonesia just a few months before, October of 2004. Previous to that, he was the ambassador of Malaysia, so he had a very good working knowledge and understanding of Asia, Asian culture, and Indonesia and how things were going there, so it became a critical link. I was down at the embassy. We also had some JTF staff down there with me, and we realized that was vital to get back to the strike group and to the ship and to the admiral, as I would have at least 1 or 2 calls a day and send out a daily email, if not more than one, a couple, to make sure the communication was flowing and everybody understood how we could best assist. It turned out to be a very, I think, critical part of our operation.
Yeah, I called Bench my bad idea suppression officer. And he did a great job, but Ambassador Pascoe was wonderful. One of the big challenges we had was just dozens and dozens of NGOs found their way to Banda Aceh. Some of them did not want to work with the military for philosophical reasons. None of them wanted to work with each other. They all asked that we take them downrange so they can do their own assessment of what was necessary, but to take 24 different NGOs on their own assessment seemed a little too burdensome and would take away from our ability to really do what we were there for, is bring this much needed aid to the various villages. So I invoked what I called the Crowder Golden Rule. We're going to do one assessment, and if you don't like that, that's fine. But I'm the only one here with helicopters, and so if you want to put one of your people on the assessment team, that'll be great, but we're only going to do one. And so we brought them on board and let them plan for a couple of days, and then we took them on one assessment trip. Next slide. This is kind of what I did while these 3 gents were running the show. A lot of press, a lot of VIPs. President Bush sent out his brother, Jeb Bush, with Colin Powell. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, up there in the top corner, and a lot of press from Dan Rather to Diane Sawyer and on and on. One of the things we decided to do is to do no briefs. When one of these anchors came out, we just asked him, do you want to go on a mission? There's some risk involved, but we'll give you 1 seat for the personality and 1 seat for your cameramen. Actually, there were no seats. They sat on the deck. And they all took us up on that, and they got some good shots, and were able to tell this story to the American public, which paid off in spades for us. I want to talk about Paul Wolfowitz. Again, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense. He came out and had an aide with him with a whole stack full of challenge coins, and he started walking around giving everyone a challenge coin. He went to the back of one of our trucks, and one of our senior chief females was there slapping bags of rice on people's shoulders, and he kind of stepped in the front of the line and tried to hand her a challenge coin, and she said something about where he could put his challenge coin. She had no idea who it was, and then followed up with that and said, you come to my truck, you haul rice. And in the vernacular, Wolfowitz took him for about 5 hours to wipe this shit-eating grin off his face because he thought it was great. And then he asked for 1,000 copies of this photograph. So
I can't emphasize enough how great a job that Buck and Bench and the Admiral did ashore in managing everything from the TNI force to TNI visitors. At one time, I think we had 7 ministers on board the ship at the same time from Indonesia, including General Sutarto, who I had lunch with, and we talked about grandchildren and golf. But so you never know, the world gets smaller sometimes. Anyway, a terrific job with the foreign dignitaries, with all the VIPs that he just discussed, and really with the media. I mean, it really was fantastic to see this decision to put a limited number of folks on aircraft. Obviously, these guys took a look at each mission and made good decisions about support and when we could put these folks on and let them tell the story globally, not just to the American folks, but globally. Obviously, Admiral, when this Washington Post copy came out, I said, well, above the fold, you can't beat that. And he said, well, it's January 4th and Congress is convening today, so there's a copy on each one of their desks. And I said, it's great to be lucky. So anyway, terrific job by them in handling everyone, and one of the least choreographed but most successful adventures with the press that we've had. So it was a great job by them.
This photograph in the Washington Post was a color photograph. Got sent out to me there back before you could go online with the Washington Post. And the byline, which you cannot read, the byline is PH3 Piper, one of the photographers on Lincoln. And so I told Kendall to send Petty Officer Piper to see me. He came in, he was literally shaking. I don't know why, because I was the people's admiral. And I said, come here, Petty Officer Piper, and he's, shaking in his boots, quite literally, and I handed him the front page of the Washington Post. I said, read the byline on that. He said, photographed by PH3 Piper. I said, you got a photograph above the fold in the Washington Post. Do you know what that means? He goes, oh, no, sir. He says, that means that every photographer in Washington is going to come after your ass because they're all jealous. And I said, well, good on you. And he kind of stepped back. He goes, sir, could I have that copy? Absolutely. But part of the kind of thought process out of this was to make sure the press got access. And not access to briefings, but access to to what was really going on, and they'll tell the story. Because in the end, if a tree falls in the middle of the woods, does it make a sound? No. It was important that the American people saw what their Navy was doing, and more importantly, the international press got this out worldwide as well. This was this is the day we finally got relieved. The decision was made by Admiral Fargo to keep us on station until they can get the hospital ship Mercy out. I had been Admiral Fargo's EA in a couple years prior to that, so I kind of called him. I said, we really need to get out of here. We've kind of done all we can do. I really don't want to wait for Mercy. We waited for Mercy. Several days later, we had a big ceremony, and it was the right call, because then the pictures went out, to the people of Indonesia, 280 million Muslims, that America came, but they're going to stick with you as we sent this wonderful hospital ship out there. I don't know why I put this picture up. This is all the Indonesian officials came to have this departure ceremony on the ship. The ambassador came, the head of the TNI came, and I think I was so relieved to get out and be headed back, because my daughter's wedding was about 2 weeks from then, and I think it really just shows that I needed a haircut after all this. Bench?
So here's a good list of some of the numbers and some of the days and some of the things that we did out there. But I'll tell you that this slide doesn't really do justice for the impact of the month plus 2 months or so that we were involved and the follow-on operations were involved. It literally changed the relationship between our country and Indonesia. We've heard the stats before, but prior to us being there, the country was about 80% anti-U.S. or 80% in favor of Osama bin Laden. And after us being there, that number literally switched in a matter of weeks. Very, very powerful impact that we had and continue to have to this day. I had the very, very good fortune of being in the right place at the right time and being able to go back to Banda Aceh for the 10-year commemoration, Christmas Day 2004. And to be back there and see that, and to see everything was resolved. As I drove around and walked around and spent time with the people there were no signs of a tsunami just a short 10 years prior. There were some very respectful elements in place. There were a couple mass graves that I went and visited that were really amazingly done. There was a museum in place, and to tour the museum, there was a whole section on the U.S. Navy and our operations that we had in the tsunami. And there was just a great culture of everyone recognizing the significant, the horrific event that occurred, but at the same time how they moved forward, and very appreciative of our impact and what we did. As I would meet people and I told them who I was or that I was part of the U.S. Navy previously, they were very, very thankful about that and still had very, very good feelings. Memorials all over the city, to include one place. There was a large fishing vessel, about 80, 90 feet or so, that had come ashore and had rested on top of houses, and they kept it there. And they kept it there, and they developed it into a park. And I asked, why did they keep it there? Well, that vessel alone, 59 people climbed onto that vessel during that horrific day and that tsunami and saved their lives. So they kept it there to remember the great news story of those 59 lives that were saved. So just to go back and see that 10 years later, to see smiling children, to see a healed culture, to see a grateful culture, incredibly phenomenal, probably the most profound thing I've ever done professionally to be part of that. Really amazing. So it was a great opportunity to be part of the whole operation.
Anyone else? This photograph was presented to us by Ambassador Pasco. We had publicly announced that the Lincoln Strike Group would be leaving on the 4th of February, and that Mercy would be coming to relieve us. Ambassador Pasco said that almost every Wednesday during his entire tour as the ambassador, there was an anti-American demonstration outside of the embassy. He said that the previous Wednesday, there were 40,000 demonstrators outside the embassy shouting, "America, do not leave." And this is a photograph he sent me. If you can't read it, it says, "No out U.S. Army from Aceh area. We love." Now, some cynical folks said, "Oh yeah, this is a U.S. information operations ploy." I said, "No, because had the U.S. Info Ops guys had done this, they wouldn't have misspelled Navy like they did here." So this wraps up our presentation. I think we have a couple minutes. If anyone has questions, we'd be happy to entertain that, or if not, we can go stand in line for lunch. Drano. Pardon me? The aircraft, you mean? Well, we, at night, when we'd go off, and even a couple days after we got everyone ashore, we went back off the coast and tried to stay as current as we could. And I think by the time we left, we were almost a full up round and ready to go if something else happened somewhere.
Yep, I had the great pleasure of doing CQ in the middle of the Malacca Strait, and it was another exciting day. We took about, we put essentially the other ships in charge that day, the Admiral did, and did day CQ, and then we sent, I don't know how many aircraft to Cobra Gold to participate in that event while we were doing these relief operations.
Yeah, so we did, have the hangar bay stacked. Most of the jets were down below, and then they were stuffed up on the roof to make room for these 8 helo spots. And we didn't change that much, but every once in a while we'd go out and try to get some flight ops in. I will say, though, that none of the air crew really complained. One of the things we did is we went into the beach every morning, right at sunrise. Each squadron would rotate 2 days on beach duty. And so the department heads would come in. They ran the soccer field as far as the flight ops were going, writing the missions down, handing them to the pilots. We need you to go to this area. You need to go to this area. Keeping track of who we put downrange, those soft medics like I talked about, the UN assessment team that we were moving downrange so they could do their assessment. All that had to be tracked so we didn't leave anybody overnight. It's the worst thing you'd ever want to do is leave someone down there in one of these destroyed areas with, because they were all counting on a ride home that evening. So the squadrons kind of took up that as their function, at least the air crew. And they would come ashore, or a group of them would come ashore. The chiefs would come in with them and kind of run the field and all the relief stuff. And so we just kept that rotating throughout the operation, so they all felt that everybody was contributing a part to it.
Yes, sir, in the yellow shirt.
As this and 9/11 shows, there has not always been a great deal of interrelationship between the civilian and government for crises. Is there any improvement in terms of long-term planning of that potential disaster around the world?
You guys going to kick this to me, huh? Well, having been the ops boss of the Navy when Katrina hit, I think we learned a lot out of that. This was an international deal, and so the infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, the U.S. didn't play that much. It was more the NGOs that played in this one. But I'll tell you, this operation gets briefed a lot around, and I think that it has been helpful to build that relationship between civilian relief organizations and the military. So,
I think one of the other keys, and the Admiral mentioned it a little bit earlier, was you know, the way the military wants to do an operation is, in this type of situation, a hindrance as well, because they want to plan, and they want to write an ATO, and they want every single one of our sorties on their ATO back at Hickam Air Force Base. And, you know, so we had to fight that and say, no, we're just, you guys get your JTF stood up, you guys figure out what you're going to do, but we're going to go in there and start working, and we'll feed you and let you catch up. And I think in this type of scenario, that's kind of the attitude you have to have. You don't want to wait. These people need help. Let the bureaucracy catch up to you instead of trying to work within the bureaucracy. Sometimes you just got to stiff arm it and go do it.
Any other questions? How about from the JOs out there? Too hungry to ask a question, I guess. Okay, Odreno, back to you then.